It was nearly 10 years ago when a few buddies and I decided to take a camping and fishing trip out at a remote lake, a few hours away from our small hometown. We were eager to unwind and kick back, so we packed up our tents, rods, plenty of beer, and some basic supplies for the weekend. The drive there was uneventful, but as we approached the lake, the anticipation built. We all had that jittery excitement you get before a big adventure, and it was hard not to feel amped up when you were miles away from the usual grind, about to enjoy a weekend off the grid. When we arrived, we found a decent spot to set up camp. It wasn't anything fancy, just 2 tents between the 4 of us and a fire pit to huddle around. After pitching our tents and settling in, we grabbed our fishing gear, stuffed a cooler with beer, and headed to the lake to see if we could reel in anything worth bragging about. By mid-afternoon, we were out on the water, lines cast, laughter echoing across the quiet lake. The hours slipped by as we cracked jokes, swapped stories, and yes, got a little more buzz than we probably should have. Around 8 p.m., with dusk settling in, we decided it was time to head back to camp. None of us had paid much attention to how far we'd ventured down the lake, and the walk back ended up being longer than we thought. It was no big deal though. The sunset over the water was breathtaking, and we figured we'd make it back before it got too dark. As we got closer to camp, Jimmy and Tom pulled their boat ashore and joined us on the trail. That's when we first noticed the flashing lights flickering through the trees ahead. They only lasted a few seconds, but it was enough to catch all of our attention. "Did you see that?" Tom asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and unease. We all glanced in the direction of the lights, but they had disappeared. "Maybe it's just some folks passing through," someone suggested, though no one sounded entirely convinced. We brushed it off and kept moving. That's when Tom suddenly froze and whispered, "Guys, bear." Sure enough, no more than 50 feet away, a bear was standing just at the edge of the woods. All of us went dead silent, barely breathing. "Just stay calm," someone muttered. "Keep walking slowly. Don't run." Step by cautious step, we inched away from the bear and back toward camp. Our hearts were pounding, but we managed to get there without incident. The tension in the air finally began to ease. "Man, that was close," Jimmy said, exhaling the kind of breath you don't realize you're holding until you're safe. Just as we thought the drama was over, a car engine rumbled in the distance. At first, we figured it was another camper looking for a spot, but when the vehicle came into view, it wasn't just any car. It was a large blacked-out SUV. The headlights washed over us, and the vehicle rolled up right next to our campsite. The doors opened, and 2 men stepped out. These guys weren't just big, they were huge. Both of them looked over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and built like linebackers. They didn't say much at first, just stood there watching us. Then one of them announced, "We're with the sheriff's department. What are you boys doing out here?" It felt off from the start. They weren't in uniform, just flannels and sweatpants, and their approach didn't seem official. Tom explained we were camping and fishing, nothing out of the ordinary. The men demanded to see our fishing licenses. Most of us had them, but something about the way they asked made my stomach churn. Why would they care so much about fishing licenses this late in the evening? I thought. Then one of the guys asked for my ID, his tone sharp and impatient. "What's the problem here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The guy stared me down and said, "If you don't hand it over, we'll have to take you in." That's when my instincts kicked in. "You're not scaring me," I said. "My dad's the chief of police for the next county over." It wasn't entirely true. My dad was a cop, but not the chief. Still, it was enough to make them hesitate. "What county are you with?" I added. They didn't answer. Instead, they exchanged glances, mumbled something under their breath, and then one of them said, "Sorry for the trouble. You folks have a good night." Just like that, they got back in their SUV and drove off. For a few moments, we just stood there, stunned. "That was weird as hell," Jimmy said, breaking the silence. We agreed, but no one was sure what to do next. None of us got a good look at them, and without badges or clear identification, we couldn't even confirm if they were cops. When I got home, I told my dad about it, and he agreed it didn't sound right. He didn't alert his department since we didn't have enough details, but he made it clear that something wasn't adding up. To this day, we don't know who those men were. Were they real officers on some kind of strange power trip? Or were they imposters planning something more sinister? And what about those flashing lights we saw earlier? Had they been watching us the whole time, waiting for the right moment? We'll never know for sure, but one thing's certain. Whatever their intentions, I'm glad we stood our ground and kept our wits about us. What do you think their deal was? Real cops or something far worse? When I first heard about Paradise Apartments, I was still in high school, flipping through glossy brochures and picturing my dream of a cozy, pet-friendly home where I could live with my 2 kittens. I was drawn to the idea of a complex that offered amenities I'd probably never use and a price that fit my limited budget. So when the time came, and I finally signed my first lease, I was over the moon. I didn't see the warning signs. Moving in felt like a rite of passage. The 1-bedroom unit was on the small side, just 600 square feet, but it was enough for me. I had a bright living room, a functional kitchen, and even a little balcony where I imagined myself sitting with coffee, watching the world go by. The complex wasn't in the best part of town, but I didn't mind. I was a homebody, spending most of my time inside working on my online courses or playing with my kittens. I didn't go out much except for a twice-a-week in-person class, the occasional shopping trip, or evenings at my boyfriend's place. At first, everything seemed fine. My days were quiet, and my nights were peaceful. But then little things started to go wrong. I began to notice my belongings weren't where I thought I'd left them. A box of socks might turn up on my bed when I swore I'd put it back on the shelf. My underwear drawer seemed to get emptied faster than usual, and sometimes when I came home from class, I'd find the box sitting in the middle of the floor. I chalked it up to my kittens at first, thinking they were getting into things while I was gone. But deep down, it didn't feel right. The turning point came one evening when my boyfriend called. He'd locked himself out of his apartment, and since I had a spare key, he asked if I could swing by and let him in. It was just a quick trip. I remember I'd left all the lights on, an unusual move since I was careful about my electric bill. I figured I'd be gone for 10, maybe 15 minutes, but when I came back, something felt off before I even unlocked the door. The blinds were slightly askew, and the lights inside were off. I thought maybe there'd been a power outage, but when I stepped in and flipped the switch, the lights came on just fine. My laptop, which I'd left open, was closed and powered down. My Lizard's basking light, which was on a timer and never turned off manually, was off. It felt wrong, like someone had been in my space. My boyfriend searched the apartment, but no one was there. No signs of a break-in. I called the emergency maintenance line. They assured me the locks were changed before I moved in and suggested it might have been a friend playing a prank. I was uneasy, but I tried to believe them. The locks were changed, and I told myself to let it go. But my suspicions about the maintenance staff grew. One of the 2 maintenance guys stood out, a younger man with a scruffy beard. He seemed a bit too casual. Once, without any prior notice, he walked into my apartment claiming he was there to replace the kitchen counter. It took him 2 days to install a small section of countertop, a job that should have been done in a few hours. On another occasion, he almost walked in on me as I stepped out of the shower. I'd barely managed to slam the door shut and told him to wait, but he claimed he hadn't heard me. I didn't believe him. There were other unsettling moments. A note left in my apartment mentioned a cute third cat. I didn't have, only a photo of my childhood cat on a shelf. Items continued to move around, and though I was careful to lock the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still coming in. I asked the office to make a note in my file that I wanted at least 24 hours notice before any entry and insisted on being present for future visits. Things seemed to settle down after that, but I was already planning my exit. Not long after, I managed to buy a condo with help from my parents and sublease the apartment. I thought I was finally free of that unsettling experience. But just before I moved out, my mom caught the same scruffy maintenance guy at my door, trying his key. He claimed he was there to paint the front door, without paint, supplies, or notice. My mom told him to wait until I'd moved out, and he left. The whole ordeal felt like the final chapter of a bad story. Years later, I was working at another apartment complex in town when a well-dressed man came in, posing as a prospective tenant. He asked about other complexes, including Paradise. I hesitated before mentioning that I'd had issues there, including a break-in I believed involved the maintenance staff. He revealed he was the owner of Paradise. He called the manager on speakerphone and confirmed that they'd fired a maintenance man around the time I lived there, someone they'd caught repeatedly sneaking into women's apartments. Hearing that confirmation brought a strange sense of validation, but it didn't erase what I'd gone through. It was a reminder that vigilance is crucial when renting. Even now, as I work in the industry, I've made it my mission to enforce strict policies, regular lock changes, proper key tracking, and clear communication with residents. I've learned that while you can't change the past, you can help create a safer future. If you've ever felt that something was off in your own rental, speak up. Don't ignore your instincts. After all, you never know who might have a key. It all started when I decided to buy a new truck back in 2008. I'd been browsing around for a while, visiting a few dealerships, but nothing really stood out. I wasn't in a rush. I wanted to take my time and find a truck that I'd be happy with for years to come. Then one day, while scrolling through Craigslist, I found a 2005 F-150 with surprisingly low mileage listed at a price that caught my attention. It needed new tires, sure, but I figured that was something I could deal with. Maybe even use as a bargaining chip. When I contacted the seller, he gave me an address, and I decided to drive over and check it out. It was a bit of a drive from where I lived, but it sounded promising. My fiancée came along for the ride, partly to keep me company and partly because, if I decided to buy the truck, we could just drive it back home together. She could take the car we arrived in, and I'd follow in the new truck. When we pulled up, we were greeted by an older man, probably in his late 50s or early 60s. He seemed like your average guy, nothing out of the ordinary. Polite, if a little curt. He didn't chat much, just straight to business, which I appreciated. After a quick look around the truck and a short test drive, I decided it was the one. I brought up the tire situation and suggested a small discount, which he agreed to after a bit of hesitation. I handed him the cash, he handed me the keys, and that was that. Driving home, I felt good about the deal. The truck ran great, and I was already thinking about getting those new tires put on and maybe taking it for a long drive the next weekend. Everything seemed perfectly normal, just another Craigslist sale that ended well. Or so I thought. That night, after we'd settled in and had dinner, I stepped outside for a smoke. We lived in a pretty rural area, so the nights were dark and quiet, with only the sounds of crickets and the occasional distant hum of a car on a nearby road. As I lit my cigarette, I noticed something at the far end of our long driveway. A figure, a shadowy shape that seemed to just stand there. It was hard to make out, but the way it moved gave me the impression it was a man. "Hey, who's there?" I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. There was no answer, just the sound of gravel crunching underfoot as the figure began to move closer. My heart started to race. This wasn't normal. I called out again, this time louder. "I'm gonna call the cops if you don't get off my property." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it kept walking toward me, slow and deliberate. I froze for a second, not sure what to do. Then instinct kicked in, and I turned on my heel and ran back inside, slamming the door behind me. "Call the police," I told my fiancée. "There's someone in the driveway." She grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed. Meanwhile, I hurried to the bedroom and retrieved my rifle. I wasn't planning on using it, but I wanted to be ready in case things got worse. When I stepped back onto the porch, the figure was gone. I scanned the darkness, listening for any sound, but there was nothing. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd scared him off. I almost laughed in relief. Maybe he just needed a reminder not to mess with us. But then I heard a scream from inside the house. I dropped the rifle and sprinted toward the sound. When I got to the living room, I saw him. The same man from the driveway had somehow gotten inside. He had my fiancée pinned to the floor. I yelled and lunged at him, grabbing my rifle and swinging it with all my strength. The butt of the gun connected with his head, and he crumpled to the floor. For a moment, everything was silent except for our heavy breathing. I grabbed some zip ties from a drawer and secured his wrists behind his back, just in case he woke up before the police arrived. My fiancée and I stayed close together, waiting and hoping the cops would get here soon. I checked the man's pulse. He was still alive, though unconscious. That was a relief. As angry and scared as I was, I didn't want to kill him. I just wanted him gone. When the police arrived, they took him into custody. Before taking him away, they examined the truck and found something that made my blood run cold. A small GPS tracker had been placed under it, likely before I ever even saw the vehicle. That's how he'd found our home. Why he did it, we still don't know. The police questioned him, but he never gave a clear reason. Maybe he was mentally ill, or maybe he had some kind of twisted grudge. Whatever the case, it left us shaken. I spent the next few weeks constantly looking over my shoulder, double-checking locks, and jumping at every little noise. To this day, I can't stop wondering what his plan was. Did he just want to scare us? Or was it something more sinister? If we hadn't been prepared, if I hadn't grabbed that rifle, what could have happened? And most unsettling of all, how many times has something like this happened to someone else without them even realizing it? I'm going to be honest, he's lucky he walked out of my house alive after what he did to my wife. Let me give you a bit of background first. For about 4 years, I dealt with a stalker. He never got aggressive or sent direct threats, so I stubbornly did my best to ignore him. I didn't want to show him any fear. To be honest, after a while, I wasn't even scared anymore because he rarely got close. His antics were more annoying than terrifying. That said, I understand that stalking can mess with people in different ways. I just happened to be one of the lucky ones who wasn't psychologically wrecked by it. This guy mostly stuck to sending me creepy letters and gifts, like photos of my apartment building taken from outside or items he'd apparently fished out of my trash. I called the police plenty of times, but they couldn't do much since he was careful never to leave enough evidence to identify him. I wasn't very active on social media, except for Reddit, and I avoided sharing anything personally identifiable online. I figured that if I didn't give him a reaction, he'd lose interest eventually. People even joked, "Does he know you're posting about him on Reddit?" I'd reply with a shrug. Maybe he'd get mad, maybe he wouldn't care. I thought it wouldn't matter either way, but it turned out he did see my posts, and he didn't like them. Like I said, he wasn't typically aggressive, but after that, things took a darker turn. A week passed with no letters, no gifts, no sign of him at all. Then, out of nowhere, he left me a letter filled with questions and answers pulled directly from the Reddit post. He even included a hateful diatribe against my boyfriend. Up until then, his letters had been bizarre but not hateful. This time, though, he was furious, especially about my boyfriend. In one part, he ranted that I should be giving him credit for all the attention I was getting online thanks to him. The next surprise came in the form of a package, which he left not in my mailbox or near my car like he used to, but right outside my apartment door. This box was larger than his usual gifts, and it was taped shut. Looking back, I realize opening it wasn't the smartest move. It could have been something truly dangerous, but I didn't think about that at the time. I just wanted to know what it was. Inside, I found a strange assortment of items: zip ties, a roll of painter's tape, a TV remote with most of the buttons removed, a pack of Band-Aids with a few that looked used, though the police later confirmed they weren't, and a framed photo of me. The picture was recent, just a few days old, and my boyfriend had been next to me in the original shot, but he'd been cropped out. The glass from the frame was shattered, and there were additional shards stuffed into crumpled newspaper as if to keep them in place. I called the police immediately. This time, they took it more seriously. They promised to increase patrols in the area. For about a week and a half, it was quiet again. No letters, no gifts, no mysterious packages. But then, 8 days ago, it started back up. I began finding letters in my mailbox, though the tone had changed. He wrote about how he felt he'd wasted his time on me and how I didn't appreciate his efforts. One letter ended with him declaring I wasn't special after all. Then, 5 days ago, things escalated further. As I left my apartment in the morning, I felt a crunch under my foot. Someone had placed broken glass under my doormat. I was in a rush, so I called my boyfriend and asked him to report it. But when I got to my car, I saw it had been vandalized. Scratches covered the sides, the lights were smashed, and the windshield had a message painted on it. It said, "It's time soon," followed by my full name. I was done playing it cool. I went back inside, called the cops myself, and showed them the new evidence. They found another note under the doormat with the same phrase. This time, the police were fully on board. I think they realized how serious it was because I was furious and made my feelings crystal clear. I also handed over my car's dashcam footage. It wasn't great quality, but it captured everything. The cops promised to step up their patrols and look into it more thoroughly. For 2 days, everything was quiet. Then, just 2 days ago, someone rang the doorbell at 4 a.m. My boyfriend and I were already on edge, so we hesitated. I peeked out and saw blue lights outside. A voice shouted, "This is the police. Open the door." They told us a neighbor had called them. One of my downstairs neighbors had come home from a late shift and heard someone enter the building after him. When he checked through his peephole, he saw a middle-aged man heading up the stairs. He knew that only my boyfriend, myself, and a single mom with 3 kids lived upstairs. None of us should have had visitors at that hour. The police caught him half a floor above us. Apparently, there's a small window up there where he should have seen the cop car, but either he missed it or he just didn't care. When they stopped him, they found a pocket knife on him. He confessed to being my stalker right there. After 4 years, countless creepy letters and gifts, and one Reddit AMA, it was over. He was arrested, and the evidence I'd collected helped make a strong case against him. I don't know what will happen in court, but for now, I can finally breathe easy. What would you do if you found yourself in my situation? Would you have confronted him sooner or handled things differently? Share your thoughts below. It was a bright, sunny day at the university when this whole thing began. I was 25 or 26 at the time, working full-time as a researcher. My job required me to spend long hours in the lab, hunched over datasets and experiments. The university was vast, with wide open lawns and winding paths under tree-lined walkways. It was a beautiful place, but I rarely got the chance to enjoy it. However, when the weather was nice, I made a point of stepping outside during my lunch break. I'd find a shady spot under a tree, eat my sandwich, and let my mind drift. It was one of those rare sunny afternoons when a young man approached me. He was carrying a small messenger bag, his posture confident but casual. He asked if he could sit on the bench beside me. I hesitated for a moment. After all, I was a bit of a shy person who didn't typically strike up conversations with strangers, but I nodded and moved my bag to make room. He settled in, then glanced at me and smiled. "Beautiful day, huh?" I agreed, offering a polite smile in return, and quickly turned my attention back to my lunch. But he wasn't deterred. He started asking questions, nothing too intrusive at first, just small talk about the weather, the campus, and whether I was a student. When I mentioned that I worked in the research department, his eyes lit up with recognition. "Oh, that's where I've seen you. You're always coming in and out of that building." This comment made me pause. I had no memory of ever seeing him before, yet he seemed to know exactly where I worked. He must have noticed my discomfort because he quickly added, "I'm in the engineering department. I pass by there a lot." I nodded, though a faint unease crept into my chest. Something about him felt off, but I told myself not to overthink it. When he asked if I'd like to grab a coffee sometime, I politely declined, mentioning that I had a boyfriend. He took it well enough, giving a slight shrug and a polite, "Maybe some other time then." I watched as he strolled off, relieved that he hadn't made a scene. I assumed I'd never see him again. A week later, I was enjoying another peaceful lunch outdoors, but my tranquility was cut short when the same man appeared. He seemed almost pleased to find me again. He smiled, asked if he could sit down, and tried to pick up the conversation right where we'd left off. My stomach tightened as I realized he was about to ask me out again. Sure enough, the invitation came, and once more I declined, reminding him about my boyfriend. His expression shifted slightly, but he stood and walked away without protest. It was then that I began to feel truly uneasy. He'd shown up twice now, seemingly by coincidence. I decided to stick to eating lunch indoors after that. For a while, everything was quiet. I hadn't seen him around and was beginning to feel a little more at ease. Then, one evening after work, things escalated. I'd parked on a quiet residential street a short walk from campus. Parking passes at the university were absurdly expensive, and I had opted for free street parking instead. My usual route took me down a series of quiet roads with little traffic, allowing me to decompress after a long day. That evening, however, as I walked, I became aware of someone behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a man keeping pace across the street. At first, I thought it was just another pedestrian, but every time I turned, Every time I changed streets, he followed. I quickened my pace. So did he. My heart started to pound. By the time I reached the final block, I was almost running. I bolted across the last intersection, sprinted to my car, and jumped in. When I turned to look, he had stopped at the corner, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. My hands were shaking as I locked the doors and drove away. I didn't look back to see if he turned to follow me on foot. Over the next several days, I became more and more cautious. I parked in a different spot each time. I had a co-worker walk with me whenever possible. Still, the feeling that I was being watched lingered. Then, one afternoon, it happened again. The student center was packed that day. I was waiting in line at a busy food stall when I heard someone call my name. My stomach dropped. It was him. He waved and started pushing through the crowd toward me. The panic from that night on the street surged back, but this time, I didn't stay silent. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice rising above the din of the cafeteria. Heads turned. He froze, clearly not expecting such a public rejection. Then, without a word, he slipped away into the sea of students. My hands were trembling as I left the line and returned to my office. I couldn't focus for the rest of the day. That was the last time I saw him. Whatever satisfaction he got from showing up and making me uncomfortable must have been outweighed by the embarrassment of being called out. To this day, I don't know his name. I never reported him to campus security. I wasn't even sure what I'd say if I did. But I'll never forget the feeling of being followed, that chill of knowing someone's eyes are on you, their intentions unclear. It's been years since that time, and I'm still cautious when walking alone. I always keep an eye on who's around me and never let my guard down. I can only hope that wherever he is, he's not doing this to anyone else.